The Future of Power, der Geopolitik-Podcast von Agora Strategy.
Herzlich willkommen zur 33. Folge des Podcasts The Future of Power, der Geopolitik-Podcast von Agora Strategy. Mein Name ist Timo Blenk, ich bin Partner und CEO der Agora Strategy Group. Und für die heutige Folge haben wir einen sehr besonderen Gast und dafür werde ich auch gleich auf Englisch wechseln zum Thema Power Politics, Cyber, Fault Lines and Washington. And our guest today from Washington is the tech rockstar, if I may say so, Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri, thank you so much for taking the time.
It's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about three main areas. First, the great power competition, mainly tech competition, tech rivalry. Since you're based in Washington, Dmitri, we also want to talk, of course, about domestic US politics. And finally, share some views also on cybersecurity and security politics. A few words on yourself. You were one of the founders and long-standing CTO of CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is one of the largest and most well-known global cybersecurity companies. You are a book author. You're an expert on international relations, global security issues. And you have founded, after your time at CrowdStrike, the Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a bipartisan think tank advising the US government, but also other institutions on everything related to security, to China, from critical minerals to tech rivalry. And last but not least, you also held several positions and advised the US government on many different aspects. So it's my great pleasure to dive into these topics with you. And let me jump directly to our first question. Given the current global uncertainty level, where do you really see that governments should prioritize on? What are the key issues in your view? And what should the focus be?
Well, there are lots of problems facing the world today, certainly facing the United States and Europe, with regards to national security issues, economic issues. But I think that the elephant in the room really is China. It is the second largest economy. It is a growing military power. And I think it is the one power in the world that can upset the strategic balance of power. Russia aspires to be that, but they don't have the capacity to do so, as we've seen them being bogged down in Ukraine. But China has the population, the economic power, and increasingly the military power to do that. And that was really the topic of my book, that I believe that the United States is now unquestionably in a Cold War with China. A Cold War that is actually remarkably similar to the first one. I originally, I've been convinced that we're in a Cold War with China for a better part of 15 years, but I always thought that it was a sort of a different type of a Cold War than the one we had with the Soviet Union. And the more I thought about it, the more I compared and contrasted the two confrontations, the more I realized how incredibly similar they are. You have a global competition for supremacy, just like we had with the Soviet Union, that's playing out in every corner of the world, not just in the Indo-Pacific, that is tech-focused, economic-focused, military-focused, geostrategic in nature. You have an arms race. That was one of the defining features, of course, of the Cold War, both a conventional arms race and a nuclear one, with both countries, the United States and China, rebuilding their nuclear arsenals, modernizing them, and China dramatically increasing theirs. You have a space race, right? 1960s, the defining decade perhaps of the Cold War was the race to the moon. What do we do now? Trying to get back to the moon. There's a controversy right now domestically in the United States. We're falling behind. We might lose to China in the race to the moon. Just so similar. You have an economic war that, by the way, predates Trump and the tariffs, with the huge amounts of intellectual property theft that the Chinese have been engaged in. Truly economic warfare against the West and America in particular for 25 years. You have a spy war. The level of espionage, according to the FBI in the United States, from China is at the highest levels it's ever been in the history of our country, eclipsing the KGB during the Cold War, in part enabled by cyber. And perhaps, and by the way, there's an ideological component to this, because China, of course, is an authoritarian country, in not alliance, but in partnership with Russia. That we're confronting as Western democracies. But most importantly, perhaps, and most relevant to the topic of my book, is that you have a regional flashpoint. What West Berlin was for the first part of the Cold War, that geostrategic territory where the two superpowers could go to war, even potentially a nuclear one, that is now Taiwan. And I'm afraid that we're increasingly marching, potentially as soon as 3-4 years from now, into a conflict with China over Taiwan, one that we're not ready for in the United States, but certainly the world itself, given the enormous dependencies economically on that region, both China and Taiwan, and the implications of that conflict for literally everyone. I mean, the projections are that in the first year of the conflict, the entire world will be in a global depression, just from an economic perspective alone. And of course, a war with China is almost unimaginable in terms of the scale of casualties, not to mention that their nuclear power, potential for nuclear escalation is there as well. So this is the issue of our time: how to confront China, how to win this Cold War, how to do so in a way that preserves our economic and military advantage, and ultimately deterring them from changing the status quo. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is preserve the status quo. The policy of the United States and Europe is to have the preservation of the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, not support Taiwanese independence, but also not support the takeover of Taiwan by force. And it is China that is trying to upend that status quo. It is revisionist power.
When we go through the different areas of U.S. foreign politics and compare it between the U.S. and China, in terms of tech, in terms of access to space, in terms of critical mineral access, where would you see the U.S. compared to China? Who is actually winning the race?
It's a great question. So when I look at the broader Cold War, there's sort of a tactical element to it of we have to deter the invasion of Taiwan and preserve Taiwan from falling under Chinese influence. But there's a broader Cold War that has to be won, mostly in the economic sphere, just like the first Cold War was arguably won. And that means winning in 4 critical technology areas and 2 components that lead to those technologies. The areas are, first and foremost, AI and autonomy. Almost self-explanatory these days. It's going to be transformative technology in every single area, whether it's life sciences, whether it's military applications, productivity enhancements, etc. Good thing is we're leading right now, right? The top models, the top companies, the top chips being designed and built in the United States. The second area that is closely related is biotech and synthetic biology. And not just in the area of medical advancements, where I think you're going to see enormous improvements, but also in the area of material sciences. Imagine being able to develop materials that are more durable for space applications, for energy applications, right? And I think in large part that will come from tight integration with AI technologies that will help us drive those innovations. Again, we have a small lead in that space right now, especially if we preserve our AI lead. The third area is space itself. We're seeing the huge transformation of the space domain in the last 15 years, particularly with the development of low Earth orbit capabilities for communications, for navigations, for intelligence collection and reconnaissance. And the U.S. has a huge lead in that space right now, largely thanks to Elon Musk and to some extent Jeff Bezos. But their usable rocketry, the dramatic lowering of the price of lift into orbit has enabled these enormous constellations of satellites in low Earth orbit that are revolutionizing everything. And the fourth area, the only one out of these 4 where we're losing, is energy, right? In particular, renewable energy, nuclear energy, battery technologies. China is clearly in the lead there, and we have to catch up. And then there are 2 components that are absolutely essential to all of these technologies. One is critical minerals, as you mentioned, where we're also losing, not because the minerals aren't available to us, but because processing and refining has been such a dominant field for China. Depends on the mineral. It's not all minerals. In some, they're better than others. But nevertheless, we have space to catch up there. And we can. I'm confident that we can. As a result of the investments that the Trump administration is making in this field, we're starting to get into a better place there. And the last component is semiconductors, chips, right? Without which you can't build anything these days. And there we have a small lead, but China is catching up rapidly. And this is an area where our tech policy needs to be more directly focused on preventing China's advancements and certainly not trying to enable them.
When you throw Europe into that equation, how is the US view on Europe as a general European Union as a partner? Is it important? Is it important in terms for trade, for technology, etc.? Or is it just a very nice extension of current US politics, but you don't really need them? How's your feeling on that?
I think on the economic competition with China, you absolutely need Europe. It's a huge economic bloc, obviously, a lot of trade relationships with China, a lot of deep technologies in a lot of these areas that I've talked about, particularly in semiconductors, right? ASML is based in the Netherlands. The Zeiss mirrors that are produced for the ASML machines are based here in Germany. Critical technology for building advanced semiconductors. So you need Europe on board with your export control policies and overall attitudes towards enabling China. I think Europe has a huge role to play in critical minerals space as well, particularly refining, processing. Countries like Estonia have traditionally built up a lot of processing capacity, although that has atrophied lately to some extent. So there's an enormous role for Europe to play in these areas. I think probably, and the Europeans may get mad at me for saying this, but probably less so in AI, because simply the investments that are required in the space, I don't think Europe can afford to muster at this point. The cost of energy in Europe makes it unaffordable to run these huge data centers in Europe. So I'm not sure that Europe will play a huge role in that particular technology development. But in others, absolutely. And the key, though, I would say that we haven't done a good job of in America of doing is convincing Europe that it's in their interest to do so. Not just because we want it, not just because we're allies and we're going to do something for Europe vis-a-vis Russia or help with Ukraine. So we expect you to help us with China. I think that's the wrong attitude, and it's the one that's less likely to achieve effects. At the end of the day, I think this is in Europe's interest, right? When I've been having conversations here in Germany with industry, it's been shocking to me how there's been this head in the sand approach vis-a-vis China for the biggest industry that is in Germany, like automotive, right? There's been this pipe dream hope for decades that China is going to be a huge market that's going to help drive growth in the industry, and it has. But the problem is that now things are changing, where China, like it has done in every other industry, is trying to kick out German automotive companies, right? Volkswagen has lost over 70% market share in the last 3 years in China. BMW has lost 30% market share. And that trend will only accelerate and continue because the end result that China wants, and wants it in every single sector, is to push out Western companies and replace them with domestic competitors. And that's what's happening. And the second phase of that, which is also something that's happened in every industry, is to use the domestic champions and push them globally, to have them take market share. That's what happened with Huawei. That's what happened with TikTok. That's what happened with lots of these companies. And that's what they want to do with BYD and NIO and all these EV companies, and flood the world with their EVs, which, by the way, are really, really good and cheaper, right? So the German automotive sector, in my opinion, not only stands to lose one of its biggest markets, China, but also lose the domestic market in Europe because of the flood of these EVs that are coming in. So absolutely, I think existential economic threat to Germany that has to be dealt with, that I don't see a lot of people are focusing on. So I think there's a lot of alliance mentality that can be created between America and China. Because to be honest with you, even in America, I'm a China hawk. I believe in Cold War that China has been waging against us, and the need to confront it on national security grounds. But the consensus on China in America is built on economic grounds. In fact, Donald Trump in large part rose to power in 2016 because he made the case about the hollowing out of our industrial base in the Midwest due to China, and that they were screwing us, and that this had to be dealt with. And that's where you've had a bipartisan consensus that has emerged in Washington on China, mostly on economic grounds, not on national security grounds. And I think it's long past due to try to build that within Europe as well.
So it's going to be a complex situation for sure for the next years. And I think the German car strategy is at the moment, one of the options might be to welcome Chinese companies, because they also need repairs, they need a trade system and so on within the country, which might bring jobs. But of course, you have to actually. I agree with you. You have to attack it from the economic.
That's a strategy
angle.
For devastation.
Yes. Let's see how it unfolds. We have the upcoming summit in the German Chancellery with the car companies. And I think there are also much differences between the different car companies. So those who are actually quite innovative, if they're stopped by again reopening the questions, do we switch to EV or not, etc., how to deal with the European Union, etc., this actually doesn't address at the same level all companies to the same extent.
But I'll tell you, the view that I sometimes hear is that, well, the Chinese are going to win the low end of the market, but the luxury end of the market we're going to preserve.
No.
And that's such a fallacy, because they're
yeah.
really, really good at that. And, all I have to say is the company that has the greatest brand loyalty in the world, technology company, is Apple. Apple is losing market share in China. They lost about 10% in the last 2 years, right? If Apple cannot survive in China, no one can survive in China, right? And by the way, it is not just China. Apple's losing market share to Chinese phone makers all over the world, right? This is just an example of what's going to happen in every industry if you don't stop them.
You mentioned before Ukraine. That's something I wanted to talk about with you. One thing is we saw Trump actually reopening the international arena for Putin in Alaska. In your assessment, what was the reasoning behind? Why did he do it?
Well, look, Donald Trump came into office second time, really focused on peace deals. He passionately believes in ending wars. He thinks wars are dumb, counterproductive. Why should people die? And clearly he's motivated to end them wherever he can. To his own admission, he thought Ukraine was a lot easier to end than he found out. He thought, I have a good relationship with Putin. Let me engage with him. Clearly, we can get this thing done in 24 hours. I think Alaska was really, really important in that he learned in Alaska that Putin is not interested in peace. So, the media headlines coming out of Alaska was that Putin won. What did he win? He got a photo op. Who cares? I think everything that has happened since Alaska has been to the detriment of Putin. What are we doing now? We're providing intelligence to Ukraine for long-range strikes against Russia, something that President Biden didn't do. There's considerations in the U.S. to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, an unprecedented development. I don't think we'll actually probably get there for a whole range of practical reasons, but the fact that this is even being considered is a huge thing, right? So, the good thing about Donald Trump is that he's not ideological. He is convincible on any foreign policy issue. He does not come at it from a particular perspective. And he came in thinking that Ukraine was the problem and you had to pressure Zelensky to come to a deal. Zelensky demonstrated that, no, I'm actually flexible. I want to negotiate. I'm willing to compromise. And it was Putin that was obstinate and preventing a peace deal to be done. And now he's pivoting. So there's an opportunity if you engage him. I think European leaders have recognized that you have to talk to him, you have to convince him, you have to make arguments with him. And if you do so, you have an opportunity to change his mind and drive him into the right direction. You're not going to push him to do what he doesn't want to do, which is he doesn't want to engage militarily, obviously, in Ukraine. He doesn't want to escalate the situation, but you can get him closer to where you want him to be if you make the right arguments.
So how do you see the conflict unfolding in the near future, this year, next year? Do you see any also options for a peace option in Ukraine?
There will be peace eventually. All wars come to an end. Unfortunately, the dynamics of the war have really not changed here since April 2022. Since the Russian lost at the Battle of Kiev, since they've been unable to take over the country and decapitate the Ukrainian government, this has evolved into a war of attrition. And the only way you win a war of attrition is by outlasting the enemy. So the only question is who is going to outlast who in this conflict, Russia or Ukraine. Both have enormous challenges. The Russian economic challenges are getting more and more severe. They're exhausting their national wealth fund supplies. They've been running deficits, and with the oil prices being down and the huge spending on the military expenditures as a result of this conflict, that has been putting real pressure on the Russian economy. The sanctions have been taking down growth as well. Unemployment is very low, which is not a good thing because so many of the men are, of course, tied up in the war. So you have huge labor supply issues, huge inflation, interest rates are over 20%. None of that is good. And on top of that, finally, particularly in the last few months, you're starting to see a break in the Russian mobilization strategy, right? So Putin did only one forceful mobilization, which was hugely unpopular. He doesn't want to repeat it. So he's been trying to avoid doing it again with these voluntary mobilizations by paying people off to sign up. Now you have bonuses up to $70,000 for people to go sign up. Death bonuses, just as much, right, for families to get paid if their family member dies. But increasingly, even that is not enough to get people to sign up because they're seeing the brutality. They're seeing that mortality rates are enormous. Your chances of dying at the front within the first 30 days are about 90%. They're going to have issues continuing this war for more than, I think, 2 years. Ukraine has similar issues. Its economy, of course, is completely dependent on support from European Union largely. It needs weapons from the West. It also has severe mobilization issues. But if it can last 2 years, I think you'll have Russia come to the table with real concessions, which right now Putin is not interested in offering because he thinks he can still win in the at the battlefield. But if he fails to achieve major progress in the next couple of years, I think he'll find himself being forced to make real concessions, and then you could get to some sort of negotiated outcome. So it's really important for Ukraine to outlast them, to obviously minimize their own casualties while increasing casualties for the Russians. The deep strike campaign that they've been engaged in for the last few months against energy supplies in Russia, particularly refineries, really, really important. You now have gas shortages in Russia, which are creating real problems for average Russians. That so far, this deal that Putin made with them is that, you're not going to feel this war if you're in Moscow, if you're in St. Petersburg. Someone else is going to fight and die for this. Don't worry, that compact is breaking down. And the more pain that Ukraine can inflict on them, the sooner this conflict will come to an end. But there is no easy outcome. You're not going to push Putin to do a peace deal now, as long as he believes he can still win. There's no Wunderwaffe that's going to change the outcome of this war immediately. There's not going to be no-fly zone. There's not going to be, European troops coming in to secure the peace. No one wants to fight and die for Ukraine. That's very clear. So they need to focus on keeping the human pipeline of infantry and drone forces to the front going. They need to stay in the fight, increase their production of long-range strike systems to keep pressure on the Russians and just survive and last. And you can beat a superpower, right? The North Vietnamese beat the United States. The Taliban beat the United States. How? By outlasting us and making it clear that they will fight as long as it takes. And we didn't have the wherewithal. And neither do the Russians. So the message that I wish Zelensky would send to his own people is that we will fight for as long as it takes. There is no shortcut here. This war won't be over by Christmas. The Europeans and NATO are not going to come and bail us out. It's up to us. That is the reality, but it's also a winnable reality. If the Taliban manage to survive against the United States, the Ukrainians can absolutely survive and outlast the Russians.
Let's hope US support continues. European support will continue. Let's switch to the next topic because I really want to get your perspective on US domestic politics. And sometimes in Europe, you're just sitting here in front of the TV or in front of social media and you're just wondering actually what is going on. So Trump declared the war from within, sending also National Guard to troops. There seems to be media censorship, for example, with AP not allowed to any press briefings because they don't write the Gulf of America, but still stick to the official phrase of the Gulf of Mexico. You had the renaming of the Ministry of Defense into the Ministry for War. So is this all a big show, or is it really a change from a clear democratic system with checks and balances more and more to a more authoritarian system? Also regarding, for example, the gerrymandering of the constituencies and the people placement in courts, etc. So can you really feel that the US is still at its top level?
Well, first of all, there's still checks and balances in the system. There's still the judicial branch that is a check on the president, any president, and you've seen both the Supreme Court and other courts have ruled against the president on a variety of issues, and he's abided by those rulings. So there's still a rule of law in the country. But look, Donald Trump believes in maximum use of power to accomplish his agenda, and he's going to push the limits of that until he's stopped by the courts. He believes he was elected for that purpose. His base believes that the country was on the wrong track, that various constituencies have been screwing us, and to use Donald Trump's words, whether it's China, whether it's the rest of the world with taking advantage of U.S. liberal trade policies, whether it's the liberals, a range of people, and he was elected to stop that. And look, his problems, as he's defining them, are actually broadly popular, not just with his base, right? There's broad consensus across the American population that illegal migration is a huge issue, right? Even many Democrats believe that. And people may disagree with his approach to solving it, but no one else is offering alternatives, which is why you still have broad support for some of those policies, because people may say, well, maybe the way he's going about it, deporting gardeners and, raiding Home Depot stores and the like for migrants is not great, but, what's the alternative, right? No one is offering any, and doing nothing, many people think, is worse than that, right? So on the trade stuff, a lot of people don't like the tariffs, and they're hurting a lot of businesses. But at the same time, people are saying, you know what? We have been taken advantage of. We've had the most liberal access to our markets. Many countries have not reciprocated and have put up trade barriers. It's time to deal with that, right? And again, there's no alternative to that. If people had said, well, let's take this other route to come up with a fair trade system, you could win. But this is why I think the Democrats have not been successful in 2024, and their ongoing ratings are down in the doldrums because they've not made a good case for how else would you solve the problems that people care about, right? So, the problems are real, but come up with new solutions.
I remember there was voting in Congress, and you saw the Democrats with so little signs, and on the signs it was written, "This is not normal." So if this is the Democratic movement against Trump, I'm not sure what they will ever achieve. But why are the Democrats so weak at the moment? Why don't they present alternatives? Where are they hiding? Did they lose their leadership with super old former President Biden? Kamala Harris not the prime candidate of the party now. So you got Gary Newsom in California, who's also trying to use Trump techniques on social media, etc. And he's quite successful, as it seems from the outside, at least to a certain level, to annoy Trump and to get followers, etc., to get a different political vision into the field.
You just said it yourself, he's successful in annoying Trump. That's not a strategy. That's a trolling technique.
Yeah.
Right? Is he successful in convincing people to come to his cause? I'm not so sure. And look, the Democratic Party has lost touch with its base. The blue-collar worker class is now voting increasingly Republican, increasingly for Trump. They're disillusioned with a party that feels like they've become out of touch. They've become too woke, too liberal, too sort of, focused on the college-educated, liberal political class in New York, Washington, and California. And the rest of the country, is sometimes called the flyover country, right? Where Democrats, don't make a lot of progress. And, you look at the map of the last election, and yeah, sure, you can look at the state maps and it seems like it's fairly close. But if you look at the county maps, the whole country is a sea of red with tiny bits of blue on each coast, right? That is a huge problem for the Democratic Party. They need to figure out how do you get back in touch with that electorate and talk about their issues and not talk about wokeness and gender bathrooms and women in sports and things that people don't actually care about. They care about the economics. They care about illegal immigration. They care about bread and butter issues that the Democrats have failed to address over many years. And until they find an answer to that, they're going to keep losing. And you can't just be an anti-Trump party because guess what? Trump is not going to be on the ballot anymore, right? He won his last election. So if you're going to win in the future, you have to find more than just, I don't like Trump.
I know it's early to say, but do you see J.D. Vance as the next follower of President Trump?
I think, he's in the lead right now, but, it's early. Who knows? Lots of things can happen. So it's hard to predict right now.
Just one last sentence maybe on the current government shutdown. Do you see room for compromise? Is it a good tactic from the Democrats, or will it blow back in their faces? And related to that, we see increasingly the domestic deployment of the US National Guard, which is, at least by some cities, really rejected. Where do you think this will lead to?
Yeah, well, on the National Guard, this is going to be adjudicated by the courts, so we'll see how that comes out. But on the government shutdowns, look, there have been a number of government shutdowns, all of them until now led by Republicans, never successful, right? They've used it in attempts to negotiate. They haven't won a thing during those government shutdowns. So the track record for Democrats is not a good one here. And frankly, the Democrats care a lot more about the government than Republicans do. Most Republicans are celebrating the fact that the government shut down. They hate the government, right? So this is playing into the Republicans' hands. Donald Trump can make it very painful for the Democrats by laying off workers, federal workers, by being very selective in how government aid gets distributed to red states but not blue states, etc. So, but look, I see government shutdowns very much like I see wars. They either last a very short period of time or they last a very long time. And I think we're on track for a very prolonged shutdown, unfortunately, because I think neither side has any interest in negotiating.
So there's just winning or losing on that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about one of your key expertise fields, which is security, but also cyber. And we discussed before tech competition. And when we see just the number and the attacks, for example, on critical infrastructure, be it airports, be it healthcare systems, finance system, the number at global scale has really skyrocketed. Just, I think, over the last 2 years in Taiwan, for example, attacks against critical infrastructure companies have been increased by up to 3,000%. These are enormous numbers. So are companies, in your view, are they naive? Are they prepared? And how do you actually act as an economic actor in a world where you're really under attack and attributed to the country where you come from, if you want it or not? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, this is a tough issue for many companies. Look, vast majority of the attacks are really criminal driven right now, right? Ransomware is basically a Russia problem because you have these gangs, criminal gangs in Russia that are orchestrating this activity. There's been a lot of progress that's been made against them. In fact, led by the FBI along with the UK National Crime Agency and others in Europe and elsewhere, they've been able to take down a number of these gangs, arrest a number of people who are not in Russia, and dampen down their activities significantly in the last couple of years. So you're seeing actually less of the headlines about major ransomware operations than you have in the past. You've also seen a shift from these ransomware crews from locking up data and asking for ransom to extortion, where they'll steal data and ask for ransom not to leak it. And that, I actually think is progress. Still not great, but at least the hospital is not down and patients are not at risk of losing their life because of a ransomware operation. And then companies have to decide whether they're going to pay an extortion demand or not, just for leakage of data. But they have to do more in securing their networks. Law enforcement has to do more in taking down these operations. We have to hold the nations accountable when these things happen in their borders, emanate from their borders. So there's both a technical part of the solution, there's a government part of the solution, and a geopolitical one as well. And you need all three.
I remember when Trump came to power, very quickly he gave the order to end offensive cyber operations by US forces against Russia. Do you see any changes in that in the near future? You expect something to be different?
Well, I'm not sure that actually happened. There was a story that was denied by the government that actually took place, so we don't know what happened with regards to Russia. But actually, on offensive cyber, the Trump administration has publicly been saying that they want more offensive cyber operations against their adversaries. They want to empower industry to conduct them potentially. So I think you're actually seeing a move in more aggressiveness in the cyber domain from the administration.
If you're not the Ministry for Defense, but for war, so the offensive plays a part in that. And when we think a bit more of the area of cyberspace, I know this is a field in which you're also interested in. Germany just last week actually announced to spend another 35 billion on space, on space infrastructure. How important is it in your view and your assessment also of future warfare? And who are the strongest space powers at the moment? Can you also see China as the main competitor? Or, I mean, you mentioned before we got this race to moon and so on. But so, is there still a space for Europe? And how important is it in general?
There is a space for Europe. Obviously, there's a lot of technologies that are being developed here, a lot of great companies. I do wish that this is one area where there would be more cooperation rather than competition between the United States and Europe. First of all, there's a practical physical limitation that there's only so much space in space, right? Particularly when you look at low Earth orbit, it's already getting very, very crowded up there with thousands, now tens of thousands of Starlink satellites, the Kuiper constellation from Amazon coming up. The Chinese want to deploy their own. So there's question of like how much room is there for a constellation from every nation? Probably not. It's also incredibly expensive if you don't operate your own lift. And the reason why these constellations are being developed by SpaceX and Amazon is not an accident, because they also have the launch system. SpaceX obviously has their own, and Jeff Bezos has a Blue Origin company that can do some of that lift as well. And that dramatically reduces the cost because you can launch for other customers and then just ride on that rocket with your own satellites and launch them effectively for free, right? So that is a huge advantage. So, it would be great if Europe thinks about developing their own constellations, either as part of U.S. constellations or as licensed technology from U.S. constellations, or at least uses U.S. lift capacity versus trying to build exactly their own. I understand the political realities and the desire for independence, but I'm not sure that this is the area where it's most important to have it. And the United States actually welcomes, particularly now, European independence in manufacturing military technologies. We don't have enough to sell, even if we wanted to, because we're so low in our magazine stockpiles. We need it for China and various other contingencies. So in areas like air defense, in areas like heavy weaponry, in areas like drones, I think Europeans should absolutely be developing their own technology. Space, I'm less certain is that important, given the dominance of the U.S., given how cheap it is for us to do it, and the fact that technology is already built. There's ways to solve sovereignty issues in other ways, right? You can imagine going to SpaceX and saying, give us Starlink, but we want to run it entirely. So it's not dependent on you. You don't have an off switch, but we'll use your tech, we'll use your launch, but we'll have the ground stations to operate it completely independently from you. And I think they would do it, right? So there's a shortcut to get there for what you want to try to accomplish without spending enormous amounts of money and potentially being late to the party, where you're going to get into a very crowded real estate that may not have much capacity for you.
So we'll see at least much movement there throughout the next years. We learned from Ukraine how quickly warfare changes. So drones become much more important. Space becomes important. We saw when Elon Musk switched off SpaceX just for a moment, Ukrainian troops really had tough choices to make and had faced many problems. So do you need the traditional way of doing warfare actually still for the future? Do you expect that? Or do you see disruptive change now with cyber, with space?
Look, warfare always changes, but it always also stays the same, right? What hasn't changed? The importance of infantry, the importance of artillery, the importance of trained manpower, the importance of air power, right? Those are constants that have been around us since World War I. And in some ways, the Ukrainian conflict is a lot like World War I, right? with addition of drones,
of course.
right? So we have to recognize that it changes on the margins. New technologies always come in, but the fundamental realities do not change. And training, good planning, logistics, enablers, intelligence, those things stay constant. And you have to think carefully about acquisition of new capabilities and not run after new shiny things, but think about how does it integrate with the overall force? How does it help me to achieve my objectives? How am I going to resupply this? How am I going to, leverage intelligence in this capability, right? For targeting, for collection of information about the enemy and so forth. And, also not being preoccupied with fighting the last war. I guarantee you that whatever the next conflict is, whether it's China, Taiwan, or something else, it will not look like Ukraine. Just like Ukraine did not look like past conflicts, right? Every conflict is different. The realities of the battlefield, the terrain, the weather, the capabilities of both sides have a huge influence on this, right? So, for example, I don't think that Western militaries should run out and buy a ton of FPV drones because the FPV drones matter to the Ukrainian battlefield. Why? Because neither side has been able to achieve air superiority and do strategic bombing campaigns across the front line. If they had that, they wouldn't rely on FPV drones. There would be much better capabilities to both collect intelligence, but also to do targeting, right? Naval doctrine is air power and air superiority. And a huge focus on that, obviously buying the F-35s and huge priorities in air defense to deny the adversary air superiority advantages. So we have to not just look at what is happening in various conflicts. We want to learn from that, but also appreciate that the way we fight in NATO is very different from the way Ukraine fights or the way Russia fights. So not everything that they're going to do is going to be applicable.
Last question on that. The European Union, the European major countries try to get a bit more independent of Trump because he's at least suspected to be not that reliable. Do you think that will be possible?
Look, this is not an issue about Donald Trump. The reality is that every American president since George W. Bush has been telling Europe that you need to wrap up defense spending because we don't have the capability to defend you when we're tied up in other contingencies, right? Just think about the scenario when the United States, God forbid, is in a war with China in the Indo-Pacific. Every single capability and enabler that we have in Europe will be sent to the Indo-Pacific, regardless of who's president, regardless to their commitment to NATO and Article 5, because we don't have the capacity to fight a two-front war. We just don't. And Europe is going to be left naked and on its own to confront Putin if he decides to be adventurous. So if you want to avoid that scenario, it's not about, do you trust Donald Trump or not trust Donald Trump? It's just the reality of you have to build up your own defenses, right? And Europe for a long time has pretended that Russia is not a problem until 2022. Now it pretends that China is not a problem. Guess what? You were wrong about Russia. You're wrong about China. And even if you think you're right, at least prepare for that contingency. That's a prudent thing to do. And Donald Trump or not, Europe needs its own independent capabilities, and particularly in the areas of enablers, right? Yes, it's great to have more artillery, more tanks, more drones. Fantastic. But if you don't have logistics capabilities to move forces, if you don't have tankers to resupply your fighter planes, if you don't have your own intelligence systems to do targeting and collection on the enemy, it doesn't matter what weapons you have, right? You're not going to be able to employ them. So it comes down to those basics that Europe absolutely has to invest in because the United States doesn't have the capacity to do it all anymore.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. The final question, you wrote the book World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century recently. What's your next book title?
Well, I'm very much focused on this issue. As I said, we're in a Cold War with China. We have to beat them. I hope that I'm wrong and China won't invade Taiwan sometime in the 2027 through 2032 timeframe, potentially Xi Jinping's last term in power. But the next book might be in 2032 about how you should have listened to me if you didn't, and the war does break out, or thank you for listening, and we managed to avoid a catastrophe.
Excellent title.
That's a joke, of course.
Yeah, excellent title. Let's hope we can stick to that and come back to that in our next session. So, Dmitri, thank you very much for being here with us today in Berlin.
I appreciate it.
Great pleasure. And to each and every one of our listeners, we'll be back in a few weeks again. And until then.